these are slides I've cannibalized from past conferences that I've presented at. And just to briefly cover off as a few shortcuts, if I say queer, even though there are many LGBTI people who might not use that particular term to describe themselves, it's just easier for me when I'm giving a presentation not to have to run through the whole alphabet. And there is a little bit of a history of reclaiming that word to remove the potent sort of negative connotations of it. If I say homophobia, I actually, unless it's in a specific context, I really mean that too as all anti-LGBTI prejudice. Conversion therapy comes under a category of suppression practices. So conversion, suppression, or change practices. And yeah, I guess if there's anything else that comes up, I'm more than happy to explain my thoughts on it. So it's about, can we describe the causes of excess mental health, morbidity, and mortality, particularly for LGBTI youth? And how can the lived experience of LGBTI people be used to help our understanding with that? And can we have a set of organising principles that can be useful in understanding queer health as a topic? And so the way I approach it is looking at dividing up periods in a queer child's life. And so there's a period where a child won't be aware of their diverse identity at all. And their parents, therefore, are unlikely to be aware. There's a period of evolving awareness, and then a time at which someone is aware, but they haven't disclosed that to anyone. And then sort of once people, depending on how safe someone's environment is, they may make a disclosure and things evolve from there. The things that make the developmental process for queer youth somewhat different to others is this prolonged period of unawareness, the discordance between the parental identity and the child's identity. And what I mean by that is basically that queer kids are, on average, born to straight parents. And in that sense, it's one of the few minorities where that occurs. So most children who have a diverse ethnicity, there's a concordance with their parents, or they are adopted by people who are supportive of that child's ethnic heritage. And so when we think about that difference between the knowledge and awareness of a parent about the possibility of having a child with a diverse sexuality or gender, that's highly variable. And there may not have been any particular knowledge that the parent has beyond what might be in the general community. That's just covering off what I was talking about there. And so if we look at some of the features that, this is not going to be something that everyone experiences, but it's trying to list some of the common features that um, we can think of in these different phases. So when a child is not aware of their own identity, they may not have, or they don't have any innate psychological filter to assimilating harmful information that may be inconsistent with their subsequent diverse identity. And so that knowledge that that a child is accumulating within their family, community, schooling environment, um, that can sow the seeds for dysfunctional core beliefs that are really very problematic as they go through normal development. Um, as a child has an evolving awareness, the initial response is frequently information gathering, um, concealing or not disclosing their identity until they have gone through that information gathering process. Maybe trying to become certain enough to know how they want to respond. And for some people, there can be this experience that I refer to as ontological shock, which is, and I can certainly recall this in primary school, there was a moment where it was just like, oh, I'm the terrible thing that everyone has been talking about. And so for a kid, that, that always occurs in isolation, and it's a potentially very dangerous period of time. As a side note, there are very few statistics that are available on fatal LGBTI suicides. It's very hard to find that data because it's generally not collected. There's often proxy endpoints that are used, so suicidal behaviour, ideation, self-harm, admissions to hospital, that sort of stuff. But accurate data on suicide fatalities is very scant and highly inaccurate. But I did see in the USA, there is a register of violent deaths, and in that database, where they had collected the data about sexuality or gender, I might get this wrong, I should have double checked this statistic, but it's something like in the 12 to 14 year age bracket, LGBTI people were, I think, 20% of the deaths in that cohort. So yeah, if we're sort of looking at that age where there's an evolving awareness of a person's diverse sexuality or gender, that can be a very dangerous period because they're isolated, alone, and it can be quite a devastating realization, especially because all of the community interactions that a child has will often be within the context of their families, religion, culture, language, socioeconomic status. And so if you think of an LGBTI child in a metropolitan, secular, relatively well-off socioeconomically, tertiary educated parents, that's going to be very different to, say, a child in a rural and remote area, religious education, or any of those other factors. And so what we sort of see is that the aggregate experience doesn't really describe it. And so I sort of think of the marriage postal survey as a pretty good gauge on rates of anti-LGBTI prejudice in Australia. And so 40% of people voted no, and they have kids too. 60% of people voted yes, and they've got kids. And so the experience within those families and contexts is going to be very different. One of the other interesting factors is that within the queer community, those who have an experience that isn't so hostile during adolescent development find it very difficult to understand the other section of the community who had it really tough and have all of the psychological sequelae of that. And, the nature of trauma or the experience within a family or community, a fish doesn't know that it is in water. And so it's very hard for us to identify our own traumas because it just seems normal. That's the way it is when you grow up in that space. So when it comes to religion and spirituality, for those people or parents or communities who are religious, it would be helpful to explain to them how harmful it is to teach a child things that will completely disconnect them from their religion, spirituality, their God. That's a really big struggle. I'm thankful that wasn't part of my struggle, but for those who go through that, it's really difficult. In the 90s, there was an organisation called Exodus, an international organisation founded by gay men, and they would all recruit and disseminate conversion therapy practices. And this entire international organisation evolved to deliver conversion therapy practices. The nature of the psychological injuries that people have incurred actually make them more likely to actively seek it out. And then once people might leave conversion therapy practices, they can then have some extra complicated feelings of guilt and shame for having participated in their own harm, but also recruiting others to the same harm. And so that can become really problematic for people once they've worked through their issues, because it's sort of that combination of being subject to these practices, but also initiating and perpetuating them. So moving on from this idea of ontological shock or evolving awareness, and looking at this stage where it's prior to disclosure. And so it makes sense that if a queer kid is in an unsafe or dangerous or uncertain environment, the obvious first strategy to avoid harm is to not disclose or to conceal. And so what happens there is that the people or the queer kids experiencing the most preventable harm remain invisible. And the problem with that is that it never prevents them from incurring harm. So they live in this environment of elevated stress for a very prolonged period of time. And we know that trauma can have epigenetic effects. Um, it can methylate certain parts of our DNA, and that can alter uh, neuroreceptor expression on cell walls. And so there's this highly complicated situation where if we want to reduce the morbidity and mortality associated with all of the complexities of growing up as a queer kid, you can't fix it after the fact. There are some things that are effective, but it will never be a good enough answer to ignore prevention, in my opinion. Then, if we're looking at the period of time after a person makes a disclosure, fairly commonly, I have seen families and parents go on their own journey of working this information through and, um, you know, moving through to the point of accepting their loved one as they are. But the terrible thing about that is it doesn't erase um, the psychological impacts. And so, I think it's very difficult for parents who have lost a queer, adult child of theirs to suicide because there's this sense of having engaged in some of the things that has made it so hard for that person to, um, manage their psychological health. And yeah, so for these reasons, the proposition is that if we think of homophobia or anti-LGBTI prejudice in the same way that we think of any other preventable harm, then it should be possible to have a public health strategy that screens for this as a risk factor and provides evidence-based short public health interventions over the cycle of a family's engagement with healthcare, from antenatal clinic through child health and general practice. And that, if we no longer have our only strategy being one that waits for queer kids to come out to then access healthcare, to one of addressing the preventable harm, I feel like there's relatively little negative impact of addressing anti-LGBTI prejudice or having a child grow up within that context of tolerance and acceptance. Obviously, there would be certain healthcare interactions where it would not be wise to add that as a focus. And, we can certainly think of the obvious ones like, a domestic violence situation. Homophobia tends to be skewed according to gender, with men and older men tending to have higher rates of homophobia than women. But yeah, so I guess from that public health perspective, it's, can we see that as public health education, giving people accurate, up-to-date, and available information. This slide covers off some of the potentially useful questions on a clinical history. And I guess the point of this is that queer adolescents and youth won't be able to come in and describe the hardships that they've been through. But if you sort of have, it's possible to take a history that is not only helpful in figuring out what's going on, but that can actually help that person have an understanding of what they've been through and the potential for that to unlock self-compassion. Because without an explanation, it's like, well, what's wrong with me? Why am I this way when others aren't? And so things like the length of time between being aware of one's own diverse identity and telling anyone, that's almost always correlated with an unsafe environment. Increasingly extreme behaviours to try and conceal one's own diverse identity. So sham relationships, that things like that tend to indicate that there's probably been prolonged periods of feeling unsafe. Interestingly, it doesn't necessarily matter whether the particular risk or harm or danger, it doesn't matter if that's accurate or not, because for the child in that environment, it's the stress response, the same stress response, whether it's a real threat or a perceived threat. And so there's an opportunity to actually raise in the awareness of parents and families areas where what someone might be intending to convey is very different to what the child receives and understands. And an example that I often give is if you're a kid in a family and you're all watching a television drama and two men kiss, and if someone huffs or vocalizes and changes the channel, in that moment, they've really only intended to communicate that they don't want to watch that. But the way that that might be experienced as a kid is, if you knew who I was, I could be abandoned or rejected, or you'd think I was disgusting, or any of those possibilities. And so interactions that a parent might think is not particularly controversial can be experienced very differently if that child has an awareness and hasn't disclosed it to anyone. I'll move on to this. This is a little bit of a note about child protection, and within the child protection legislation, and we're all aware of the high cost, poor outcome area of I guess state or foster care of a child. Putting that aside, the primary response from within the area of child protection is actually a public health response. It's about educating families and communities in ways that prevent harm. Obviously, there is a lot of focus on that very high acuity end of things, but if you think of all sorts of strategies that we have in primary schools and community organisations, or positive parenting programs, or child health programs, these are all addressing preventable harms to a child. Yeah, and so the question is, if we estimate that 40% of families in Australia may have elevated rates of anti-LGBTI prejudice, and if we sort of think, if there's a 5% chance that any one of their kids could be, could grow up to have a diverse identity, the question is that risk of harm something that we find acceptable, or that we should address? And that has to be proportionate to, I guess, the costs of doing so, and the potential downsides of the intervention. And I would argue that both of those are actually in favour of fairly simple public health information. So I guess a lot of people are aware of the harms of conversion therapy, and that conversion therapy is regulated. But if we think about suppression practices more generally, or informal conversion therapy practices, they're actually more dangerous, because within a therapeutic setting, there are at least some limits on the types of harm that people can experience or fear. Within a community setting, practices that are suppression or conversion can be associated with real or perceived fear of abandonment, fear of violence or any other form of abuse, and sometimes actual violence and abuse. And so, if we think of conversion therapy within a therapeutic context, it doesn't come with those additional risks. The other thing that is useful to think about is that laws that criminalise queer people, that's like a population level suppression practice. And, in Australia, it wasn't until 1997 that it was no longer a crime to be a gay man. And so everyone in a certain cohort has experienced some form of suppression practice within Australia.
97, is that what you said?
Sorry?
1997?
Yeah, that's when Tasmania finally repealed their law. Yeah. I might just briefly... Oh God, there's so many different ways I could
You sound like you've got a deck of slides. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was just reading about Exodus conversion therapy. I saw something about how 99% don't convert. Is there any
doesn't work. You can't change a person's sexuality through external influence.
Yeah, and so therefore it's all sort of been shut down. Is that your impression?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, one of the founders,
2012,
one of the founders has then gone around the world actually deconstructing that whole
process. Is that what happened? Okay. Yeah.
I think it's actually illegal. It's illegal now in Australia.
Yeah, so each state and territory has been looking at regulating and prohibiting conversion or suppression practices. But Tasmania, that only occurred last year, I think. And the legislation was somewhat watered down, I believe. So there is a variable um, degree of regulation about that. And I mean, if we think about what was that school in, was it City Point
Christian College.
Christian College? Yeah, so they were doing contracts, you know, uh, yeah, sexuality and gender contracts with their
Oh, is this
children.
like a abstinence kind of contract? Is
It
that
was,
is it?
yeah, it was that, but it was about sexuality and gender. It's like I will not, under any circumstance or whatever,
Wow.
be
Okay.
same-sex attracted or whatever it was.
The language was particularly awful too because the letter that they had to.
Awesome.
Yeah.
It's like AMA Queensland only recently, like maybe it was only 4 or 5 years ago that we did a policy paper on conversion therapy. Is it that recent that Queensland outlawed it?
Yeah, it hasn't been around for a long time, I don't think.
Has it been
Um,
removed for a long time or banned or whatever for a long time? Is that what you're saying?
uh, no, I think the legislation was only in the last couple of years. I can't.
Yeah, good. Yeah,
Um,
yeah. No, I thought I remember it, working through it.
mm,
Um, and when you talk about religion, I guess, Katie knows I've asked this question before. Is it every single religion that's got this and I'll use your word homophobic element? Because presumably this is, very much it, I mean, I can see it's in our culture and I can see it is in some other cultures, but it's not, presumably this homophobic concept is not global. Is that fair?
there was a large dissemination of it through colonization. So
Ah,
the laws from England were replicated through a lot of the world.
mm,
Um, and like it's particularly tragic in Australia where there are Indigenous Australians who have been taught homophobia within their religious conversion, and
yeah,
then
of course.
you sort of interact with um, young Indigenous adults who have been, yeah, kind of had to leave their family and community um, over something that was taught to their family and community through colonization, which
Mm.
feels particularly, um, yeah, terrible.
I'll get you to unshare your screen so that I can see your face a little bit better.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
um, Katie, you feel free to butt in. I'm just ticking through my
I was just going to
questions.
make a comment on
Yeah.
conversion practices because I've heard some prominent psychiatrists and
Yes.
psychologists referring to exploratory identity therapy, and it doesn't fall under the legislation of conversion therapy, but looks to explore alternative identities in the LGBT youth
Mm.
cohort.
So, the idea of gender exploratory therapy, it sounds benign. And, I think in healthcare, we want to support people to find out for themselves who they are. And now, the particular history with gender exploratory therapy is an organization was formed and it was called the Gender Exploratory Therapy Association. And then a group of 6 of those people wrote a 100-page guideline on gender exploratory therapy. The problem with it is it hasn't demonstrated non-inferiority to the current standard of care. And it seeks to assume safety data from other forms of psychotherapy without demonstrating safety for their new form of psychotherapy. It's sort of a little bit like Purdue used the safety data of opiates in palliative care when they expanded it to other non-palliative indications. And so we just can't assume the safety data from all psychotherapy to this new form of gender exploratory therapy. And that 100-page document, it really is focused on exploring these potential traumas and harms that have led that adolescent or child or young adult to manifest a diverse gender as a result of these psychologically traumatic things. And it doesn't propose to do that in a way that also offers that adolescent the opportunity to access puberty blockers. And so it can compel that child or adolescent to go through irreversible changes of puberty for a gender that they don't want to express or don't identify with. And that can be particularly harmful in a society where we really do ridicule people. Like the Austin Powers thing of, but yeah, she really looks like a man or whatever. It's like we know that these are common forms of ridicule, but and so for those reasons, I think it's really not ideal for a trans woman to have a large Adam's apple and a deep voice. I feel it's unethical to be persistently engaging in what they refer to as gender exploratory therapy without also offering the current standard of care. And then if you look at the actual document, it just runs in this relentless loop of if the child hasn't abandoned their diverse gender, they need more psychotherapy. And it goes around and around and around. So that's gender exploratory therapy. The other thing that I actually wanted to touch on is the Nuremberg Code. So we all think of that as the cornerstone of medical ethics, and of course we know that arose from the Nuremberg trials in post-Nazi Germany context. So after the Allied forces liberated Germany, queer people who had been incarcerated during the war and who were actually involved in, or some who were in concentration camps and others who were in prisons, they were all seen as legitimate prisoners. And they received no war reparations, and the laws that criminalised queer people remained. So they couldn't speak out or express what they'd gone through without exposing themselves to legal peril. And so that led to the erasure of queer people in the Holocaust for an extremely long time, but it's quite well documented. And it's included in the Holocaust Museum in Berlin and other quite reliable sources. Now, the idea of the Nuremberg Code, one of the fundamental ideas was that research should only be conducted for the benefit of the population being researched. But in the context of queer people and the ongoing criminalisation, the concept of what was for their benefit was eradication of the trait. We don't do research on prisoners to help them accept and embrace their repeat offending. So in a way, there's almost like an echo of a genocide around that concept. And Australia is the only country that created a prison solely dedicated to queer prisoners. And that was in, I think, Cooma. I think it was Cooma Prison.
What, the Sunshine Coast?
Oh,
Surely not.
no, it's somewhere in New South Wales.
Oh, good. Okay. That would have been
Cooma's near the Snowy Mountains.
Oh, different Cooma. Okay. Yeah, I thought you meant, panoramic ocean views. Now that would have been funny.
Yeah, so we've kind of got this legacy and this history of the medical profession being involved in actually promoting harmful information. And if we sort of compare that to our response to medical profession involvement in smoking, contrast about what might be a proportionate response for actively correcting that misinformation. Because there's a lot of parents and families who, growing up in the shadow of pathologization and criminalization, if you were a parent in the 70s or 80s and you think every single institution is telling you that if you love your kid, you should do everything within your control to prevent them from being gay. And that was military, education, religion, even the judiciary, and the parliament. And in fact, one thing that made my adolescence really terrifying is I was aware of, from the age of 6, all of the Grim Reaper ads. And I was aware of the bashings and murders that were happening in Sydney. But the gay panic defense, so, if a man murdered a gay man, they could claim that, they made a non-violent sexual approach to me and I was so distressed I murdered them. And so they could have diminished culpability. They'd have it downgraded to manslaughter or whatever. That was like a confected defense that it feels like the judiciary really made up on their own. Like there was no corresponding psychiatric diagnosis
that said that was
reasonable.
They just decided.
Yeah, and so it sort of sent the message that, well, if murder can be somewhat tolerated, then anything less than that, it makes your entire existence quite dangerous.
I remember that time. Katie, did you have a clever question instead of my shallow ones?
That's kind of put me on the spot a little bit, Sarah. Maybe Charles, you've got a clever question. I think my clever question is, it sounds like an absolutely fantastic organisation, James, and you're very knowledgeable and passionate and driven. Is this being taken up by government? Like when you say this is a public health campaign, is this actually real and happening in Queensland Health? Or is that your wish?
That would be my wish. But, it could easily be done in private practices, allied health practices, psychologists, it's not a big deal to put up a poster in a waiting room. Over the past few years, I've spoken to so many really awesome people. But then I've also spoken to some people who they don't disclose that they are philosophically opposed to it, but they will find a reason that becomes a barrier. For instance, like, what's your numbers needed to treat? And it's like, well, you think of a study design that can adequately crystallize that? And, you know, also don't make me do your job. And then, like, last year in the Royal Darwin Hospital, the health minister directed them to take down all of their Pride paraphernalia. And so we've got something that really is actually a public health intervention being
Yes.
removed on political or ideological grounds. And there's a really great report that came out of La Trobe called Rainbow Realities, and it's the results of something like 5 different surveys, total of about 100,000 responses. And one of the really interesting statistics is that when LGBTI people had sought healthcare and were asked if they felt like their identity was supported, only 40% said yes. And I think that's a number that we can really easily improve.
Mm.
And I don't think it means that 60% of healthcare workers are not supportive.
Mm.
I think when we're working with traumatized people, we need to be able to anticipate that they might be scared of us and need a little bit of reassurance and have that moment of, being really open with people and saying, I am supportive. I don't know everything either. And, so if I say I'll do something that makes you suddenly feel really unsafe or threatened or whatever, like, if you can find a way to bring it up with me, I'd really like that. Because, so many of us might not have had an experience of healthcare where we are afraid of healthcare. But there are so many obvious examples of being afraid of healthcare. Whether it's a parent who brings a sick kid to a hospital and then ends up with a child protection report or a punitive response. There are so many people who have had. I'll give you an example. A really good friend of mine had been seeing this doctor for a while, I think like 3 years or something, and this is like a guy in his 60s. And he eventually decided, oh, well, it's probably worth like coming out to my doctor. And it was just kind of like more something to just, like it was almost embarrassing not having sorted it out. So he came out to his doctor, and his doctor was like, he came out as gay. And his doctor said, oh, but you don't wear women's clothing.
Oh.
And like my friend just laughed. But if you're a scared and frightened adolescent and it's the first time you've been able to access healthcare when you finally have independence from your family or community, that is very disorienting.
I guess what I'm hearing is that, sometimes doctors can be a little bit better as a community to take on new ideas. Certainly if we see science and, we see something's working, we do tend to embrace it. And you've given us some, statistics, and you've explained why the statistics are hard to generate. I guess, the public health message might be a little bit trickier. And obviously with AMA Queensland and AMA, you're doing that work. But presumably changing the culture within medicine is a little bit quicker.
Yeah, so back in the 90s when I was a medical student, I did make some effort to ask the Australian Medical Council to actually have competency criteria in LGBTI health. Because the AMC... so that taught me all of the usual deflections that they would come up with, which then became very handy a few years ago, probably back in 2021, I think it was. And I contacted the Australian Medical Council, and they still had no competency criteria around LGBTI health. So they set the curricular standards for all of our
Yeah.
medical faculties and colleges, but they had a dual role with international medical graduates where they set the competency criteria, but they also managed the pathway.
Yeah.
I was able to show them that in the
I know where this is going.
workforce of Australian general practice, 24% of doctors had obtained their degree in a country that criminalised queer people, and that their medical curricula was at extremely elevated risk of unscientific and harmful depictions of queer people and really significant knowledge gaps. So that was an interesting process. And
Does the College of GPs have a curriculum?
so look, I think just no one had contemplated that that was a
Oh,
huge gap.
yeah,
And, the Australian Medical Council sort of said, oh, well, we've just assessed overseas trained doctors according to our Australian standards.
yeah,
And it's
yeah,
like,
yeah,
yes,
yeah.
but
But
your
Western
Australian
standards.
standards were silent on this. And so it was a really interesting process. And last year, when I was at the AMA conference on the Gold Coast,
Yeah.
the deputy CEO of the AMC was there, and I asked her, and she spoke about the body of work that they've been doing around that, which was a very different response to what I'd received 2 years earlier.
Really? Yeah, it's
Yeah.
interesting how a few years can make a difference. And you wouldn't think, when 1 year you get a flat no, and then 2 years later you get, oh, there's a process being built in. And you think, why did you give me a flat no?
Oh, well,
You
that
know?
didn't stop me. And I think
No,
I
no,
know
I
what the
know.
process
I
happened.
know it's not going to, and it doesn't usually stop me, but it's just nice if people can be.
There are certain segments of society that might be viewed in a hostile way, and you can kind of understand it based on people's experiences. But what I like to sort of get people to reflect on is that, say for instance, if the queer community has a negative attitude towards, like an evangelical Christian community, it's like, well, have you thought that maybe that's where the queer kids experiencing the most preventable harm are? And if we can't find a way of connecting with those people, and, you know, respecting the fact that people are at any particular moment doing the absolute best that they can, especially for their children and family. Um, yeah, so there's got to be more of like an empathetic and compassionate connection somehow. Um, and, I also think that that is a reason why we need doctors who belong to those communities to be on board. Like it's not okay to just be like a conscientious objector on the topic. Couple of other anecdotes. I about 2 or 3 years ago had explained my project to a vice president of a college, and they had, we had like a 10 or 15-minute discussion, and it was winding up, and they were kind of disconnecting and explaining that it wasn't for them. And then the very last thing that they said to me was, oh, goodbye, and oh, God bless. And it was like, oh, that's really interesting. For them, that was, I imagine, or at least one of my interpretations is that's an expression of rejection, disgust, opposition, whatever it
Yeah,
was.
yeah, yeah. That's signaling.
So that was really interesting. And then one other thing that I wanted to flag, the College of Psychiatrists have a position paper. It's position paper 103, and it's the role of the psychiatrist in working with trans and gender diverse people. And one of the things it states is it opposes or prohibits conversion therapy, but it then goes on to say psychotherapy is not conversion therapy. And if you look at the legislation, say in Victoria, the Victorian legislation specifically says we can evaluate psychotherapy according to the objective criteria of conversion or suppression practice, and it's actively included. And the history of this area is that psychotherapy absolutely has been one form of conversion or suppression practice. So it's factually incorrect. It's just logically incorrect to declare that something so individualized could never stray into that area. And so, yeah, I think for those who have been following it, there is this fire that is raging within the College of Psychiatrists because they just cannot address a segment of their voting membership who feel very compelled to act on the basis of their unconscious or overt prejudice. And, you know, there is a group of people who I think are acting in bad faith, and it relies on a range of people not being motivated enough to truly understand the topic and to inform themselves, who then become misled by concealed or research or I guess medical education that has an undisclosed and improper purpose. It's, and one of the things I tend to say is that for the people who are vocally creating a very, what's the word? If people are saying that they are genuinely interested in the welfare of trans and gender diverse adolescents and adults, if they're saying that they're concerned about that and they are opposing the current standard of care, but they aren't also simultaneously working to reduce homophobia, then it's unlikely that they're acting in good faith. If they're this concerned about trans and gender diverse kids, why aren't they worried about gay kids and preventing psychological harm? Why are they so focused on this? And, it's like, yeah, but I mean, there's a whole range of ethical considerations that we could use to evaluate that kind of conduct. But even the National Health and Medical Research Council, on the Australian Health Ethics Committee, there's people with expertise relevant to people with a disability. They've got someone on there with expertise in religion. There is no person on the Australian Health Ethics Committee with expertise relevant to the needs of LGBTI people. And then if you look at the National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Human Research, Chapter 4 lists populations with specific ethical considerations, and it has the populations that you would probably think as being very appropriate, except it doesn't include LGBTI people, even though there's a history of the medical profession actively getting it very, very wrong, and it remains one of the most contentious issues in contemporary society, and they haven't sort of identified that group and made clear statements about, you know, how to actually determine what's for the benefit of this population. So there's a long way to go. And I'm hopeful that if the Australian Medical Council are on board with that and they're thinking about it, I do know that the NH&MRC have created a national statement on variations in sex, gender, sex characteristics, and sexuality. And that's very useful. But yeah, there's a long way to go.
All right, James, I'll let you off the hook at that point because we've run over time. But Katie, if you've got any last minute questions or
I'm going to contact James offline.
Awesome.
We will be continuing this.
Awesome. That's what I wanted. Yay.
Thanks so much, James, and thanks, Sarah, for
feel free to share my mobile and I'll look forward to hearing from you.
I'll do that right away. So thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate your insights. I always learn something every time. Even when I only catch you for 10 minutes, I always learn something. So, and thank you for pointing out my bias. Thank you, Katie. Again, my lack of perception. Just being a simple orthopedic surgeon, it's a different world over here, over the other side of the highway. So thank you, James, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you, guys. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.